Security guard smashes street musicians. Violin. Symphony invites musician and fires the guard. The crack wasn't just a sound. It was a physical event that rippled through the chilly November air. A sonic fracture, sharp enough to make pigeons burst from the pavement, and stockbrokers 2 blocks away look up from their phones. It was the sound of history breaking. The sound of a soul snapping, dot splinters of ancient spruce, polished to a warm honey glow by a century of loving hands, exploded. From the point of impact, the security guard's thick-soled regulation black boot came down a second time. Not with the frenzied rage of a man losing control, but with the cold, methodical finality of an executioner. The violin's elegant scroll, carved by a ghost, in a long-forgotten Viennese workshop, separated from the neck with a sickening crunch. The bridge, a delicate maple heart that had pulsed with the music of generations, launched into the air and skittered across the granite plaza like a frightened insect. Leo felt the impact in his own sternum. He didn't cry out. He didn't move. The world had narrowed to the space between his own frozen feet and the mangled carcass of wood and wire at the base of the gleaming corporate tower. His violin. His grandfather's violin. His only violin. Guard, whose name tag read Mark, straightened up, his broad chest swelling beneath the crisp, gray fabric of his uniform. He was a thick, solid man, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He nudged a piece of the shattered soundboard with the toe of his boot. "I told you, no soliciting. This is private property." The words were absurd. Soliciting. Leo hadn't asked for anything. He had been giving. He had been pouring out a batch, petit to the notes, soaring and braiding themselves into the cold city air. A gift to anyone who cared to listen. He played for the joy of it, for the necessity of it, for the coins that appeared like magic in his open case, allowing him to eat, to live, to play again tomorrow. But there would be no tomorrow. Not now. The scene was a frozen tableau under the gunmetal gray sky. The plaza, a sterile expanse of polished stone and brutalist planters, was designed to impress and intimidate, a concrete moat around the glass and steel castle of Omnicorp Global. Lunchtime workers, clad in their own uniforms, of charcoal suits and sensible heels, stood in a loose, silent semicircle. They were the audience. Some held phones, the little black rectangles silently drinking in the scene. A woman with a cashmere scarf pressed over her mouth looked horrified. A young man in a hoodie shook his head slowly, a frown etched on his face. But no one spoke. No one moved to intervene. They were spectators at a public execution. Mark's gaze swept over them, a silent challenge. He was power. Leo was powerlessness. That was the simple, brutal equation of the moment. The guard's authority was derived from the colossal building at his back, from the logo on his chest, from the unspoken rules of a world that valued property over passion. "Pack up your trash," Mark said, his voice dripping with contempt, "and get out of here before I have you arrested for trespassing." Trash. The word landed like a punch. Leo finally moved, sinking to his knees as if his strings had been cut. The cold of the granite seeped through the thin fabric of his trousers, but he didn't feel it. His hands, long and graceful, trembled as they hovered over the wreckage. He saw the faint pencil-thin signature inside the broken body, visible through a splintered F-hole. Klaus Richter, 1923. His grandfather had bought this violin after the Great War, with money saved from working on the docks. He'd said it was the only beautiful thing he'd ever owned. He'd passed it to Leo's father, who had passed it to Leo on his 16th birthday. His hands calloused from carpentry, but his touch on the instrument impossibly gentle. "It has a voice, Leo," his father had said. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Now, its voice was silenced forever. Leo's fingers brushed against a shard of wood. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the shock. His grandfather, smelling of pipe tobacco and varnish, teaching him how to hold the bow, not like a hammer boy, like you're holding a butterfly, firm enough so it doesn't fly away, gentle enough so you don't crush its wings. He had crushed the butterfly. Or rather, this man, this stranger in a cheap uniform, had crushed it for him. And why? For a rule. For the sterile tidiness of a corporate plaza. The light was fading, though it was barely 1 in the afternoon. The sky seemed to press down, heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of damp concrete, car exhaust, and the faint, cloying scent of a pretzel vendor a block away. The tension in the air was thick, a palpable thing, like the silence in a theater just before the curtain rises. But this was no play. This was raw, unscripted, and hideously real. The faces in the crowd were a blur of muted colors and indistinct features, a gallery of silent witnesses. Their silence was its own kind of violence, an invisible wall that isolated him with his shame and his grief. Mark adjusted his belt, the leather creaking with smug satisfaction. He represented order. Leo and his chaotic, beautiful music represented a disruption to that order. In this place, at this moment, order had one dot. Leo, slowly, carefully, began to gather the pieces. The neck, tragically intact, except for the joint, the chin wrist, a smooth dark piece of ebony that still held the faint warmth of his skin. He picked up the scroll and held it in his palm. It felt like holding the skull of a small, delicate bird. He placed each piece into the worn, blue velvet interior of his open case, a coffin for a murdered friend. The coins lay scattered amongst the ruins, mocking him with their uselessness. What good was money now? It couldn't buy back a ghost. It couldn't mend a century of sound. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting Mark's. Leo's eyes were a deep, soulful brown, now swimming in a grief so profound it seemed to have no bottom. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes asked the question that echoed in the silent plaza. Why? Mark flinched. For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something, doubt, regret, shame, crossed his face. It was there and then. It was gone, replaced by a mask of hardened indifference. He turned his back on Leo and walked towards the gleaming glass doors of the Omnicorp building. His duty done. The crowd, its grim entertainment over, began to dissipate, melting back into the rhythm of the city, leaving Leo alone on his knees in the center of the cold, empty stage. The butterfly was crushed. The show was over. Leo remained on the cold stone long after the last spectator had gone. The city's indifferent symphony swelled around him, the hiss of bus brakes, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 1,000 conversations he wasn't part of. Each sound was a reminder of his own sudden, profound silence. He felt hollowed out, a vessel that had once been filled with music, now just an empty, echoing space. He carefully closed the lid of his violin case, the click of the latch unnaturally loud in the quiet plaza. It felt like closing a casket. He stood up, his knees aching, and lifted the case. The weight was all wrong. It was heavier, a dead weight, the clumsy gravity of broken things. It used to feel light, an extension of his own arm, humming with potential energy. Now, it was an anchor. He walked, he didn't know where he was going. His feet, clad in worn leather boots, seemed to know the way, carrying him away from the gleaming towers of wealth and power, towards the humbler, grittier streets of his own neighborhood. He walked past cafes, where people laughed, their faces warm in the golden light. He passed storefronts, displaying things he could never afford, gleaming watches, silk dresses, artisanal cheeses. The world was pulsing with life, but he was a ghost moving through it, invisible and unheard. His apartment was a small, third-floor walk-up in a building that smelled of damp plaster and fried onions. It was more of a room than an apartment, but it was his sanctuary. A single window looked out onto a brick wall, but a sliver of sky was visible if he pressed his face to the glass. Music stands crowded one corner, piled high with sheet music. Bach, Beethoven, Paganini, he saw. They looked like accusers now. He placed the violin case on his narrow bed, unable to bring himself to open it again. Just looking at the black, scuffed exterior made his chest tighten. He sank into his only chair, a lumpy armchair he'd found on the street, and let his head fall back. This was it, the bottom. He had no savings to speak of. The violin wasn't just his passion, it was his livelihood. It was his connection to his family, to his own identity. Who was Leo without his music? He was just a man in a threadbare coat, with no skills that the world seemed to value. He could translate the most complex musical notation into heartbreaking beauty, but he couldn't operate a cash register or write a line of code. He closed his eyes, and the image of the boot coming down burned behind his lids. The arrogance on that guard's face, the cold, dead satisfaction, and the silence of the crowd. That was the part that truly clawed at him. Their complicity, their quiet consumption of his humiliation. Was this what people were now? Passive voyeurs, documenting disasters with their phones but unwilling to lift a finger to stop them. Despair was a physical thing, a heavy cloak settling over his shoulders. It whispered insidious thoughts into his ear. Give up, it's over. You were a fool to think you could make a life out of something so fragile. The world is made of concrete and steel, not spruce and maple. You don't belong. He thought about his grandfather, who had survived a war and worked his fingers to the bone, finding solace in this very instrument. He thought about his father, who had encouraged him, who had driven him to lessons, and sat, through countless squeaking, squawking recitals, his face beaming with pride. What would they think of him now? He had failed them. He had let their legacy be shattered on a cold, indifferent sidewalk. He sat like that for hours, as the sliver of sky outside. His window turned from gray to bruised purple, to inky black. The room grew cold. He didn't bother turning on the light. The darkness was a comfort, a place to hide. Finally, a deep, guttural sob escaped his lips. It was a sound of pure agony, torn from the deepest part of him. He wept. He wept for the violin, for his grandfather, for the lost notes that would never be played. He wept for the ugly, casual cruelty of the world. When the tears finally subsided, he was left with a profound emptiness. He felt scoured clean, a blank slate. It was in that moment of absolute stillness, of utter defeat, that something shifted. A tiny, defiant spark ignited in the void. He got up and walked to the bed. His hands trembled as he undid the latches on the case. He opened the lid. The sight was even worse than he remembered. A jumble of splintered wood, tangled strings, and shattered varnish. A massacre. He reached into the mess, his fingers carefully navigating the sharp edges. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. A piece to hold onto. A final connection. His fingers closed around something thin and metallic. He pulled it out. It was the G-string. Miraculously, it was intact, still attached to its tuning peg at one end, and the tailpiece at the other. A length of silver wound gut spanning a chasm of destruction. He held it up in the gloom. It was just a string. A single, useless string. But as he looked at it, something else came into focus. It wasn't useless. It was potential. It was memory. It was one, single, unbroken note. An idea, insane and beautiful, began to form in his mind. It was an act of pure, irrational defiance. A refusal to be completely silenced. He took the broken neck of the violin, the scroll still attached. It was a solid piece of maple, something he could hold. He carefully, painstakingly, unwound the G-string from the shattered body and secured the tailpiece to the base of the neck. He then reattached the tuning peg to its hole, creating a makeshift, one-stringed instrument. A ruin. A ghost. He tightened the peg, plucking the string with his thumb. It produced a dull, mournful thud. But it was a sound. He found his bow, its horsehair slack and forlorn. He tightened it, rosined it, his movements slow and deliberate. A ritual he had performed 1,000 times. He sat on the edge of his bed, lifted the broken neck to his shoulder, and drew the bow across the single string. A note emerged. A low, guttural G. It was raw, wounded, and achingly mournful. It wasn't the rich, complex voice of the violin he knew. It was the sound of a survivor, the cry of a ghost. He played it again, and again. He closed his eyes and began to improvise. A melody, a simple, heartbreaking lament on that one lonely string. The music was skeletal, stripped of all harmony and flourish, but it was pure emotion. It was his grief, his anger, his despair, and that tiny, flickering spark of defiance, all translated into a single, vibrating line. He didn't know how long he played. He played until his fingers ached and his arm was numb. He was no longer just a man in a dark room. He was a musician again. He had found his voice. It was broken. It was scarred. It was barely a whisper. But it was his. And tomorrow, he knew what he had to do. He would go back. He would go back to that same plaza, with his one-stringed ghost. And he would play. They could break his instrument, but they couldn't break his music. The teenager's name was Maya. She had filmed the whole thing on her phone, her thumb hovering over the stop button, her heart pounding in her chest. She was the one in the hoodie, the one frowning. She hadn't intervened because she was scared. The guard was big, angry, and had an air of untouchable authority. She was 17, but her silence had felt like a betrayal. And the video on her phone felt like evidence of a crime. When she got home, the footage haunted her. The sound of the cracking wood. The musician's devastated face. The guard's smug cruelty. She watched it 3 times, her own anger growing with each viewing. This wasn't right. It just wasn't right. On an impulse, she uploaded the video to TikTok. She wasn't an influencer. She had 87 followers, mostly friends from school. She didn't add any flashy effects or trending audio. She just used the raw, shaky footage. For the caption, she wrote, "This happened today at the Omnicorp Plaza. A security guard destroyed this man's violin just for playing music. This is not okay." She hesitated for a second, then added a hashtag. It felt silly, but it also felt necessary. A way to categorize the injustice. Hashtag justice for Leo. She had no idea his name was Leo. She just thought it sounded right. She posted it and, feeling emotionally drained, put her phone away to do her homework. When she checked it an hour later, her phone was having a seizure. Notifications flooded the screen. A ceaseless cascade of likes, comments, and shares. Her 87 followers had become 5,000. The video had 100,000 views. The comments were a torrent of outrage. This is disgusting. Omnicorp needs to answer for this. The look on his face. My heart is broken for him. That guard should be fired and charged with assault. Where can we find this musician? I want to donate. The video was ripped and reposted to Twitter, to Instagram, to Facebook. On Twitter, it was picked up by a local news blogger, who added the Omnicorp corporate handle. Suddenly, the hashtag wasn't just a label, it was a weapon. Hashtag justice for started trending in the city. By midnight, it was trending nationally. The internet did what the internet does. It became a detective agency, a jury, and a fundraising machine all at once. Someone recognized the plaza. Someone else found Omnicorp's corporate contact information and flooded their email and phone lines. A facial recognition enthusiast ran a screenshot of the guard through a program and came up with a name, Mark Petrov. His sparse social media profile was quickly unearthed and deluged with angry messages. By morning, the story was on every major news outlet. Viral video shows security guards smashing street musicians' priceless violin. The narrative was irresistible. The powerless, soulful artist versus the faceless, cruel corporation. David versus Goliath, with a soundtrack of shattered dreams. Leo woke up the next morning, blissfully unaware of the digital storm raging in his name. He drank a cup of black coffee, ate a piece of stale bread, and prepared himself for the day. He dressed in the same clothes as yesterday, took his one-stringed ghost violin, and walked back to the Omnicorp Plaza. He was terrified, but his fear was smaller than his resolve. When he arrived, something was different. A small crowd was already there, and news vans, several of them. A reporter with a microphone and a cameraman in tow saw him approaching and rushed towards him. "Are you the musician from the video?" she asked, thrusting the microphone in his face. Leo was bewildered. The video of your violin being destroyed. It's everywhere. The whole country is talking about it. My God, is that what's left of it? She asked, her eyes widening at the broken neck in his hands. Before he could answer, another reporter shoved in. Then another. They surrounded him, a flock of hungry birds, firing questions at him. What's your name? How did it feel when he did that? Is it true the violin was an antique? Omnicorp has issued a statement. Have you seen it? He didn't even know what they were talking about. He felt dizzy, overwhelmed. He looked past the cameras and saw the spot where his life had fallen apart yesterday. He pushed through the media scrum, his face set. He had come here to do one thing. He walked to the center of the plaza, took out his bow, and began to play. The single mournful note of the G-string cut through the clamor. The reporters fell silent. The crowd hushed. Cameras, now dozens of them, all turned to him. In the heart of the media frenzy, he created an island of profound, wounded silence, punctuated by that one, lonely note. He played his lament, his eyes closed, pouring all the grief and defiance of the last 24 hours into the bow dot. It was this image that became the icon. Leo, with his gaunt, expressive face, standing against the backdrop of the cold corporate tower, playing a song of sorrow on the ruins of his instrument. It was a visual so powerful, so heartbreakingly cinematic, it was almost mythological. It was the thumbnail that would launch 1 million more clicks. Across the city, in a luxurious penthouse apartment overlooking the park, a woman was watching the scene unfold on a massive flat-screen TV. Her name was Amelia Petrova, and she was the principal cellist for the city's world-renowned symphony orchestra. She was 28, a prodigy who had conquered the classical music world with her ferocious talent and passionate performances. She watched the close-up on the musician's face, on his hands, on the broken instrument, and she felt a wave of nausea. As a musician, the act of destroying an instrument was a sacrilege of the highest order. It was a book burning, a desecration. She picked up her phone and, without hesitation, tweeted from her verified account. "This is not just vandalism. This is an assault on the soul of our city. Music is not a crime. My heart is with this brave artist. The City Symphony should give him a stage." Hashtag #JusticeFolio. Her tweet, coming from a figure of her stature, was like pouring gasoline on a bonfire. It was retweeted by thousands, including other famous musicians, actors, and cultural commentators. The idea took hold instantly. The symphony should invite him. Amelia felt a righteous fire burning in her. She was a kingmaker in this world, and she would use her power to lift this man up from the ashes. Then, the news anchor on the TV said something that made the blood drain from her face. We're now getting the identity of the security guard, who has been suspended pending an investigation. His name is Mark Petrov, a former employee of several private security firms with a clean, if unremarkable, record. Amelia's phone fell from her hand and clattered onto the polished marble floor. There were thousands of Petrovs in the city. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But she knew it wasn't. She frantically searched for the original video, the one Maya had posted. She zoomed in, pixel by pixel, on the god's face, on the thick neck, the rigid posture, the cold, angry eyes she knew so well, the eyes she had inherited. The security guard, Mark Petrov, was her father. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. For Omnicorp, it was a public relations nightmare of the highest order. Their brand, carefully cultivated to project an image of forward-thinking, community-oriented innovation, was now synonymous with brutal, petty cruelty. Their stock price dipped by 3 points in the first hour of trading. The CEO, a man named Henderson, was in damage control overdrive. Fire him, he barked into his phone, pacing his corner office on the 50th floor, the very office that looked down upon the plaza where the disaster had unfolded, and release a statement. We are appalled and disgusted. His actions do not reflect the values of Omnicorp. We are launching a full internal investigation. Blah blah blah. You know the drill. He hung up and looked down at the plaza. He could see the news vans, the crowd, and the tiny figure of Leo, still playing his one-stringed lament. Henderson sighed. The kid had guts. He'd give him that dot. Mark Petrov got the call an hour later. He was at home, in his small, tidy apartment that smelled of stale coffee and regret. He'd been watching the news, his stomach churning. He saw his own face, grainy and unflattering, on the screen. He saw the musician, looking like some kind of tragic saint. He saw the hashtag Justice for Leo. He hadn't known the man's name. The call from his supervisor was brief and brutal. He was fired, effective immediately. His final paycheck would be mailed. He was not to set foot on Omnicorp property ever again. He hung up the phone and sat in the silence. The words echoing in the empty room. Fired, disgraced, a villain on the national news. A lifetime of simmering resentment, of feeling cheated and overlooked, had boiled over in one stupid, violent act. He hadn't even been that angry, not really. It was just the principle of it, the rules. He was paid to enforce the rules. This musician, with his sad eyes and his beautiful, sorrowful music, had made him feel small. The music was a language Mark didn't speak but had once desperately wanted to. It felt like a judgment. So he had lashed out. He had asserted the only power he had. And now, that power was gone. He was just a middle-aged man with no job, and a face everyone in the country seemed to hate. Meanwhile, for Leo, the world had turned upside down. As he played, people started approaching, not just reporters, but ordinary citizens. A woman in a business suit pressed $100 bill into his hand. This is for a new violin, she said, her eyes wet with tears. A construction worker gave him his unopened lunch. A young woman, the teenager Maya, approached him shyly. I'm the one who posted the video, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm so sorry this happened to you, but I'm glad they're seeing it. Leo, overwhelmed, didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was gratitude. A GoFundMe page, started by an anonymous supporter in another state, had gone supernova. The initial goal was $5,000, enough for a decent student violin. By noon, it had surpassed $100,000. By evening, it was approaching $250,000. Donations poured in from all over the world, each one accompanied by a message of support. From a fellow musician in Japan, keep the music alive. From a teacher in Ohio, you've taught my students a lesson about dignity. This is from my kids' piggy bank. They cried when they saw the video. Leo, back in his tiny apartment that night, stared at the numbers on his phone screen, unable to process them. It was more money than he had seen in his entire life. He could buy any violin he wanted, a Stradivarius even. But the thought brought him no joy. It felt like blood money, earned through a public crucifixion. The true power flip, the one that would change everything, came in the form of an official email. The subject line read, "An invitation from the city's symphony orchestra." His heart hammered against his ribs as he opened it. The email was from the symphony's artistic director himself, a legendary conductor named Maestro Julian Croft. It was concise and direct. "Dear Mr. Leonidas," they had found his full name. "We at the City Symphony have been moved, as has the entire world, by your display of courage and artistry in the face of such a senseless act. Your dignity has been an inspiration. The guest soloist for our winter gala this Saturday has unfortunately taken ill. It would be our profound honor if you would consider taking their place. We believe your voice, your story, deserves to be heard on the world's greatest stage. We would, of course, arrange for the finest instrument for you to play. An honorarium of $20,000 would be provided. Please let us know if you would consider gracing our stage. The city is listening. Sincerely, Julian Croft." Leo read the email 5 times. It didn't seem real. The City Symphony, the Winter Gala. It was the most prestigious musical event of the year. He had bought a ticket to sit in the nosebleed section once, years ago. He had dreamed of playing on that stage, a fantasy so wild he had never dared to speak it aloud. And now, it was being handed to him. Not because he had practiced for 10,000 hours. Not because he had won a grueling competition. But because a man had smashed his violin and a teenager had filmed it. The irony was so thick he could taste it. Karma, it was a strange and powerful force. The man who had tried to silence him had inadvertently given him the world's biggest microphone. But, as he stared at the email, another thought crept in. A sliver of ice in his gut. Could he do it? Could he stand on that hallowed stage, under the bright lights, and be anything other than the victim from the video? He wasn't a novelty act. He was a musician. Or was he? He no longer knew. The power had flipped. No doubt about it. The god had lost everything. Leo had gained a fortune, fame, and the opportunity of a lifetime. It should have felt like a triumphant victory. But as he sat in the quiet of his room, the broken ghost of his violin resting in its case, it felt complicated. It was about to get much more complicated. Amelia Petrova drove through the rain-slick streets, her knuckles white on the steering wheel of her Tesla. She was heading to the one place she never went, the place she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape, her father's apartment. After seeing the news, she had called Maestro Croft, the symphony's conductor, a man who had been a mentor and a father figure to her since she was a teenager. "Julian, it's me," she'd said, her voice shaking. "The guard, the one who smashed the violin. It's my father." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Julian Croft was a man who had seen everything in the cutthroat world of classical music, but this was new. "Amelia, my God, are you certain?" "I'm looking at his face on my television. Yes, I'm certain. The press. If they get a hold of this," he began, his mind immediately running through the strategic implications. "I know," she cut in. "That's not why I'm calling. Your offer to the musician, Leo. It's a wonderful gesture. It's the right thing to do. But I need to ask you to hold off on announcing it. Just for a day. Let me talk to him." "Talk to who?" "The musician." "No," Amelia said, a wave of dread washing over her. "My father." Now, standing outside his drab apartment building, the same building she had fled at 17 with a cello on her back and a scholarship in her pocket, she felt like a ghost. This was the source of all her ambition, all her rage, all her ferocious, desperate need to succeed. It all started here. Her father, Mark Petrov, was once a musician himself. A decent one. Even he played the double bass in a regional orchestra. His dream, always just out of reach. He had auditioned for the City Symphony 3 times and been rejected 3 times. The rejections curdled his passion into bitterness. He started drinking. He blamed the system, the judges, the elites who couldn't recognize his talent. He told Amelia that classical music was a rigged game, a rich man's hobby. Yet, he pushed her relentlessly. He was her first teacher, his lessons a strange cocktail of genuine musical insight and simmering resentment. When her own talent began to eclipse his, he couldn't handle it. Her success became a mirror for his failure. The day she won the scholarship to Juilliard, he didn't congratulate her. He got drunk and punched a hole in the wall. She left the next day and had barely spoken to him since. She knocked on the door. It opened a moment later. He looked older than she remembered. His face was puffy, his eyes bloodshot. The swaggering authority of the security guard was gone. In its place was a defeated, broken man. "Amelia," he breathed, his voice hoarse. He seemed shocked, as if he were seeing an apparition. "Hello, Dad," she said, her own voice cool and distant. She stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as she remembered. Oppressively clean, sparsely furnished, smelling of loneliness. A framed photo of her, from a concert program 10 years ago, sat on a small end table. It was the only personal touch in the room. "You saw the news," he said. It wasn't a question. "The whole world saw the news," she replied, not letting him off the hook. He sank into his armchair, the one he always sat in, and buried his face in his hands. "I don't know why I did it, Leah. I just snapped. This guy, with his fancy violin, playing that music, right there, in my face, like he was mocking me." "He wasn't mocking you, Dad. He was just playing. It's what musicians do. You, of all people, should know that." "What I know is what that world is like," he shot back, his voice rising with the old, familiar bitterness. "It's for them, not for us. The rich kids with the fancy teachers. The ones who look down on people like me, people who have to work for a living, who have to wear a uniform and take orders." He looked at me like I was dirt. "Did he?" Amelia asked softly. "Or is that just what you wanted to see?" This was the twist. The core of the entire, ugly affair. This wasn't about a rule. It wasn't about soliciting. It was about a lifetime of failed dreams and curdled resentment. Mark hadn't smashed a stranger's violin. He had smashed a cymbal. Leo, the gentle street musician, was a stand for the entire world of classical music that Mark felt had rejected him, a world his own daughter now ruled. In his mind, he was kicking back against the system that had crushed him. It was a tragic, pathetic, and deeply human act of misdirected rage. "They fired me," he mumbled into his hands. "I have nothing." Amelia looked at her father, this shell of a man, and for the first time in a decade, the wall of anger she had built around her heart began to crumble. She saw him not as the monster from the news, but as the sad, broken man he had always been. It was a horrible, dizzying feeling. He had committed an unforgivable act. He deserved the public condemnation. He deserved to be fired. And yet, he was her father. This was the wrong but tempting moment. The impulse to protect, to shield, to defend, even when the person is indefensible. It's the tribal pull of blood, the deep, primal instinct that wars with our sense of justice. She could call Maestro Croft back. She could leverage her own power, her own indispensability to the orchestra. "If you fire my father, you create a scandal around your star cellist. If you want me on that stage, find another way." A quiet settlement, a public apology from him, but let him keep a job, any job. It was a tempting thought, a path of damage control. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but the sight of her father, so utterly defeated, made it feel almost right. She sank onto the edge of the stiff sofa, the chasm between them as wide as it had ever been. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, the question hanging in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. He looked up, a desperate, pathetic hope flickering in his eyes. "You're one of them now, Leah. You have power. You could talk to them. Explain." "Explain what?" she thought. "That my father is a bitter failure who takes his misery out on innocent people." The moral dilemma was no longer an abstract concept. It was sitting in a threadbare armchair right in front of her. On one side was Leo, a man who had been publicly humiliated and wronged, a man she had publicly championed. Justice demanded that his aggressor face the full consequences. Her own integrity demanded it. On the other side was her father, the man who had given her life, who had taught her her first notes, whose own broken musical dreams had, in a twisted way, fueled her own success. Could she simply abandon him to the pyre of public opinion she herself had helped to build? What would that say about her? What would she do? The decision fell not to Amelia, but to Leo. Maestro Croft, a man with a keen instinct for both music and drama, understood the volatile situation immediately. The story of the star cellist and the disgraced security guard was a media firestorm waiting to happen. If it broke, it would overshadow the narrative of Leo's triumphant debut, turning it into a sordid family drama. He needed to control it. He arranged a meeting, not in his office, but in a neutral, private rehearsal space deep within the bowels of the concert hall. It was a large room with a polished floor, a single grand piano, and an acoustic so perfect it seemed to hum with latent energy. Leo arrived first, feeling small and out of place. He wore his only suit, a slightly too large charcoal wool he'd bought at a thrift store. Maestro Croft greeted him with a warm, firm handshake. He was an imposing man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Mr. Leonidas," Croft said, his voice a rich baritone. "I am so glad you are considering our offer. What happened to you was a disgrace. We want to make it right." A moment later, the door opened and Amelia Petrovna walked in. Leo recognized her instantly. He had posters of her. He had all her recordings. To him, she was not just a musician. She was the musician, a goddess of the cello. He felt his face flush, and he was suddenly intensely aware of his ill-fitting suit and his scuffed shoes. "Amelia, thank you for coming," Croft said. "Leo, this is Amelia Petrovna, our principal cellist." "I know who she is," Leo said, his voice barely a squeak. He extended a clammy hand. "It's an honor." Amelia took his hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes filled with a pained sincerity. "The honor is all mine, Leo. I was so moved by your performance in the plaza. It was the bravest thing I've ever seen." The compliment, from her, meant more than all the money in the GoFundMe account. But before he could properly absorb it, Maestro Croft cleared his throat. "There is a complication," he began, choosing his words with surgical precision. "A delicate matter, which is why I asked you both here. Leo, the security guard, who destroyed your violin. It has come to our attention that he is Ms. Petrovna's father." The air went out of the room. Leo stared, first at Croft, then at Amelia. Her face was pale, her expression anguished. The goddess was suddenly, shockingly, human. He saw the family resemblance, now the same intense eyes, the same set of the jaw. "My father and I have been estranged for many years," Amelia said quickly, her voice tight. "What he did is inexcusable. I want you to know that. I championed you before I knew, and I still do. This changes nothing about the orchestra's offer to you. But it changed everything." The beautiful, simple story of justice and redemption had suddenly become a tangled, ugly mess. If he accepted, he would be sharing a stage with the daughter of the man who had shattered his world. Every time he looked at her, he would be reminded of the boot, the crack, the splinters of wood on the granite. The triumph would be forever tainted by this bizarre, intimate connection to his own humiliation. "The board is concerned," Croft continued, his tone pragmatic. "They have terminated Mr. Petrov's contract with the security firm, which we employ. Publicly, that is the end of it. Privately, they are worried about the optics if the media discovers this connection. They fear it will look like we are punishing our star player's family. It gets messy." This was the dilemma, laid bare. For the symphony, it was a PR problem. Do they risk a scandal by fully backing Leo, or do they try to quietly manage the situation, which might feel like a betrayal of the public trust they had so loudly proclaimed? For Amelia, it was a crisis of loyalty. Does she protect her career and the institution she loves by distancing herself from her father? Or does she follow the wrong but tempting pull of family and try to mitigate the damage to him, potentially at her own professional and moral cost? But for Leo, it was the most profound choice of all. The world was offering him his wildest dream on a silver platter. The money, the fame, the stage. All he had to do was say yes. All he had to do was step over this one, deeply uncomfortable, personal detail he could compartmentalize. He could be a professional. He could accept the win, no matter how it was achieved. Wasn't that what anyone would do? Take the money and the glory and run. Or, he could say no. He could reject the offer. He could walk away from the tainted victory and stand on his own. He could use the $250,000 in the GoFundMe to buy a new violin, a new life, on his own terms. He wouldn't be the symphony's victim hero. He would just be Leo. It would mean sacrificing the stage, the fame, the validation from the very institution he revered. It would be the harder path. The quieter path. He looked at Amelia's tormented face. He looked at Croft's calculating one. He thought of his grandfather's violin, not as a priceless antique, but as a vessel of love and history. He thought of the single, lonely note he had played in the plaza. What was that note about? It wasn't about getting famous. It wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to let the ugliness of the world have the final say. What would you do? The question wasn't spoken, but it hung, in the silent, perfect acoustics of the room, directed at everyone and no one. What do you do when your dream comes true, but it's for all the wrong reasons? Leo took a deep breath. "Maestro Croft," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "your offer is the greatest honor of my life. And Amelia, your music has been a light in my life for years. He paused, and in that pause, the fate of 3 people hung in the balance. And that is why I cannot accept. The words landed with the quiet finality of a closing door. Croft's eyebrows shot up. Amelia looked stunned, as if he had slapped her. I don't understand, the maestro said, genuinely bewildered. The fee, the instrument. We can negotiate. It's not about that, Leo said, shaking his head. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the clarity of a difficult decision made. This opportunity, it was born from an act of violence and ugliness. If I take it, that ugliness becomes part of my story, part of my music. It becomes the reason for my success. I can't build a life on that foundation. He turned to Amelia. What your father did was wrong, but he's still your father. For me to stand on that stage, for us to play together, it would be a lie. We would be pretending this connection doesn't exist, and the music would know we were lying. It would be hollow. He was letting her off the hook. He was releasing her from the impossible position of having to choose between him and her family. He was taking the burden onto himself. I have over $200,000 that people from all over the world gave me, Leo continued, a sense of wonder in his voice. They didn't give it to me so I could become a star. They gave it to me so I could buy a violin and keep playing. That's the promise I need to keep, not to a concert hall, but to them, to my grandfather, to myself. He walked over to the grand piano and gently placed the broken neck of his violin, his one-stringed ghost, on its polished black surface. This is the most important instrument I will ever own, he said softly. It taught me that music isn't in the wood or the strings. It's in here. He tapped his chest. It can be bruised and broken, but it can't be silenced. Not really. He looked at Croft. Thank you again for the offer, maestro. I hope one day to be good enough to earn an invitation for my music alone. And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the most powerful people in the city's music scene in stunned silence. He walked out of the concert hall, back into the noise and the chaos of the city, not as a victim, not as a hero, but just as Leo. He had walked in with a broken violin and walked out with a whole soul. The final image, the one that went viral, in a way no one could have predicted, wasn't of Leo playing on the grand stage of the Symphony Hall. It was a grainy cell-phone picture, taken a week later, that appeared on a local blog. It showed Leo, in a small, packed community center in his own neighborhood. He was holding a new violin, a beautiful, unadorned instrument, its varnish still smelling fresh. He wasn't on the stage, just on the floor, surrounded by a circle of children, their faces rapt with attention. He was playing for them, the music simple, sweet, and full of joy. Behind him, taped to the wall, was a handmade sign that read, "The Richter Music School. First lesson is always free." He had used the GoFundMe money not to buy a priceless antique for himself, but to purchase dozens of student violins and start a free music school for underprivileged kids. The power hadn't just flipped. It had been transformed. It wasn't about revenge or fame. It was about creation. It was about taking the ugliest moment of his life and using it to build something beautiful. Mark Petrov was never seen in public again. He moved to a different state, a broken man haunted by a single violent act that had defined him. Amelia Petrova continued to be a star, but her music changed. Critics noted a new depth, a new, profound melancholy in her playing, as if she were finally playing for herself, and not against the ghost of her father's failures. She and Leo never spoke again, but every year, on the anniversary of the incident, a large anonymous donation would arrive at the Richter Music School. Cruelty always collects its debt. But sometimes, dignity pays a dividend you could never imagine. Where are you reading this from? Drop your city, your state, your country. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next justice twist.